What would you do if you came home to find strangers tearing up the earth where your family's history was buried? Would you fight, or would you walk away? Rusty Thornfield didn't even have time to ask himself that question, because the answer was written in the sound of bulldozers chewing through a century of Texas soil and the laughter of men who didn't know what they were destroying. The first thing he noticed wasn't the noise, it was the smell. Fresh concrete, dust, sharp as lime, mixed with something that didn't belong. The ghost of mesquite smoke from his grandfather's forge, clinging to the old oak beams like a memory. He stood in the doorway of the house he'd grown up in, boots sinking into mud that had never known anything heavier than a cattle hoof, and he thought he'd lost his mind, because outside his kitchen window, where prairie grass once rolled, like green ocean, stood skeletons of houses. Not one, not two, dozens. Stud frames stabbing the sky, bright orange safety vests moving between them like worker ants. And then came the voice, smooth, sweet, venom wrapped in velvet. "Oh, honey," she said without looking up from her phone. "You're home early." He turned, and there she was, in his father's kitchen, wearing Lululemon and sipping coffee from a chipped mug that said, "World's Best Dad" in faded blue letters. A stranger. No, not just a stranger. A woman who carried herself like she owned the world. Designer workout clothes, perfect manicure, and that smile, the kind you see on real estate billboards, selling dreams they never planned to deliver. She set the mug down gently like she was doing him a favor by not breaking it. "Vivian Ashworth Sterling," she said, flashing teeth too white to be honest. "President of Thornfield Estates, HOA." Like the words should mean something to him. Like she wasn't standing in a kitchen built by his great-grandfather's calloused hands, where his father had taught him how to drink coffee black and strong enough to peel paint. Rusty stared at her, not speaking. Not yet, because his mind was still trying to make sense of the world outside that window. The sound of hammers pounding nails into wood that wasn't theirs, the earth torn open like a wound, and this woman smiling like the devil had just joined a yoga class. What the hell is this? His voice came out steady even though his heart was beating hard enough to crack ribs. Vivian didn't flinch. She didn't even look up from scrolling her phone. "It's progress, sweetie," she said. "Your daddy signed the development agreement 2 years ago. Didn't he tell you?" For a second, Rusty thought he'd misheard her. Maybe the grief was making him crazy. 2 weeks of hospital disinfectant still clung to his clothes, a phantom smell he couldn't scrub off. 42 nights in a chair, by his father's bed while cancer chewed the old man down to bones. 6 weeks of watching monitors beep and drip fluids into arms that once roped cattle like lightning on leather. He had buried his father 3 days ago, lowered him into the Thornfield Cemetery under live oaks that had stood through drought, flood, and every other cruelty Texas could throw at a man. And now this woman was telling him that, sometime between chemo cycles and morphine fog, his father had signed away 847 acres of Texas hill country. For what? A golf course? A subdivision? "That's impossible," he said, voice low, because if he let it climb, it would turn into something that would get him arrested. Vivian slid a stack of papers across the kitchen table, glossy nails tapping the corner. "There's the signature," she said, like she was teaching a child to read. "Right there. December 14th, 2 years ago. Permits are approved, construction's ahead of schedule, and frankly," she gave him that smile again, the one that could cut glass. "Your little cattle operation is an eyesore. This land is going to house 75 beautiful families, master-planned community, walking trails, a clubhouse. Thornfield Estates is the future." Rusty didn't move, didn't blink, because if he did, he might break something. His father's favorite mug, the woman's perfect nose, the lie sitting on that paper like a rattlesnake sunning itself. He picked up the copy, rough edges scratching his fingers. And there it was, his father's signature, shaky, Weak, a man fighting morphine and tumors and time, dated during the worst of it, when the old man thought the TV remote was a telephone. He stared at the ink until his vision blurred. And then he looked at her. "Get out," she laughed. Actually laughed. A sound so cold, it could have frozen the Gulf. "Sweetie," she said again, like she was saying it to a dog that wouldn't stop barking. "You don't own this land anymore. You're technically trespassing." Through the window, Rusty saw men in neon vests pour concrete into trenches where his cattle had grazed since 1889. He saw survey stakes, not where they used to be, but closer. 200 feet closer. And something inside him, something older than his name, older than the bones buried under those live oaks, snapped. He reached under the counter and pulled out a roll of parchment so old it smelled like history. India ink signatures. Deeds that had survived dust storms and bank failures and every other storm life had thrown at them. "This land," he said, laying it on the table like a weapon, "has been in my family for 134 years. Vivian didn't even glance at it. She was already gathering her papers, sliding them into a leather portfolio worth more than his first pickup. "And now," she said, heels clicking across hardwood his grandfather had laid by hand, "it's going to house 75 families who appreciate progress. You should think about finding somewhere else to live, somewhere that appreciates rural charm." The door closed behind her with a whisper that sounded like betrayal, and then the bulldozers roared louder, like they knew they'd won. But they hadn't. Not yet. Because as Rusty stood there, staring out at the desecration of everything he loved, he felt something rise up inside him. Something his father had given him without words. Something the land itself had planted in his bones. It wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was older than that. It was the same thing that had made a man pick up a plow in 1889 and carve a life out, of rock and clay and stubbornness. It was the understanding that some things aren't for sale, not for any price. And if someone tries to take them, you fight. He didn't know how yet. Didn't know where to start. All he knew was this. They'd picked the wrong man. And this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The screen door slammed behind him, hard enough to rattle the glass, but he didn't feel it. His boots hit the porch steps and then the dirt, moving on instinct, like a man walking into his own funeral. The air smelled wrong, not just of diesel and wet concrete, but of something deeper. Violation, like blood in water. He crossed the yard without seeing it. The wildflowers his mother had planted, now crushed under tire tracks. The garden fence his father had mended with baling wire, last spring ripped open like a wound. And then he saw it. The orange stakes, bright plastic markers stabbed into the earth like fluorescent lies, and they weren't where they were supposed to be. Rusty knew every inch of this land, every mesquite root, every limestone ridge. He'd been walking these fence lines since he was old enough to follow his daddy on horseback. And those stakes, they weren't just moved. They were gone. Replaced. 200 feet inside his property. Which meant one thing. Somebody had stolen more than paper rights. They'd stolen the ground itself. He crouched and touched one, his calloused fingers brushing plastic that still smelled of hardware store shelves. Fresh. New. And in that moment, something inside him turned cold. The kind of cold that doesn't thaw. Because this wasn't ignorance. This wasn't an accident. This was a plan. A theft so big it swallowed history whole. The rumble of engines pulled him back. He looked up and saw a bulldozer crawling across what used to be winter pasture, its blade shoving dirt like a grave digger with no conscience. Behind it, a cement truck spun lazy circles, feeding gray poison into trenches carved into land his family had bled for. And beyond that, God help him, there were rooftops. Half-built McMansions squatting like parasites where cattle once grazed under blue Texas sky. A row of houses lined up like soldiers, each one a bullet aimed at the heart of everything. Rusty believed in. "Mr. Thornfield?" The voice came from behind him. Smooth, practiced, like someone who talked for a living. Rusty turned and saw the law. A deputy sheriff in a tan uniform that suddenly looked like enemy colors, and next to him, a man in a suit. The kind of suit that costs more than a month's feed bill. Rusty didn't need an introduction. He knew the type. City attorney, professional liar. The deputy held a thick envelope in one hand, like it was something sacred. Rusty knew better. Paper only has power if you let it. "Afternoon," the deputy said, not meeting his eyes. "Got some documents for you." The lawyer did the talking, of course. They always do. "Mr. Thornfield," he began, voice smooth as motor oil, "my name's Marcus Webb, counsel for Ashworth Development Group. I'm here to inform you that you are currently trespassing on private property. Mrs. Sterling holds valid permits and title for this land. You have 30 days to vacate voluntarily." Rusty stared at him, not blinking, not moving, just letting the words hang there like smoke from a grass fire. 30 days. To leave land that had been Thornfield since before Texas had electric lights. He took the envelope, felt the weight of it, thick with legal language and lies. He didn't open it. Didn't have to. He could smell the poison inside. Webb kept talking because men like him can't stand silence. "Of course," he said, straightening a tie that cost more than Rusty's boots. "We'd prefer to resolve this amicably. Mrs. Sterling is prepared to offer you a generous settlement, $50,000 for the entire property." Rusty almost laughed. 50,000. Austin parking lots sold for more. But Webb wasn't done. "If you choose to fight this," he continued, polishing his words like silver bullets, "we'll have to explore tax complications with your father's estate. And there's always eminent domain if this becomes a public safety issue." The deputy shifted on his feet, eyes on the dirt. Rusty recognized him. Bought cattle from the Thornfields 2 summers ago. The man looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. But Webb was enjoying this. Rusty could see it in the glint of his cufflinks, the way his smile curled like barbed wire. "Oh," Webb added like it was an afterthought, "Mrs. Sterling asked me to mention she's received complaints about an unstable property owner threatening construction workers. Sheriff's office takes those seriously." Rusty said nothing, because if he opened his mouth right now, he'd say something that would land him in jail before sunset. He let the silence stretch until it started to hurt. Then he turned, walked past them without a word, and headed back to the house. He didn't look back. Didn't have to. He could feel Webb's smirk burning into his spine like a brand. Inside, the silence hit harder than the wind. The house smelled like coffee gone cold and sawdust from men who had no right to breathe his air. He dropped the envelope on the table. It landed with a thud that sounded like the closing of a coffin. For a long time, he just stood there, staring at the wood grain, listening to the faint hum of machinery chewing up his life outside. His father's voice whispered in the back of his mind. Words the old man had said 100 times, sitting on the porch watching the sun bleed out behind the hills. "A man's land is his word, Rusty. You let someone take that, you ain't got nothing left." Rusty sank into a chair, elbows on the table, head in his hands. For the first time in weeks, the tears came. Not for his father, not even for the land, but for the way the world had changed while he wasn't looking. A world where paper mattered more than promises, where money could move mountains and erase history. He sat there until the tears dried to salt and something else rose up in their place. Something harder, hotter, like iron pulled from fire. When he finally looked up, his eyes were different, cold, sharp, the eyes of a man who'd made a decision. He stood, walked to the wall where his father's Winchester hung, and rested a hand on the stock. Not to take it down. Not yet. But to remember what it felt like. The weight of it. The promise of it. "They think this is over," he said, voice low, the words tasting like steel. "They think they can bury us under concrete and lies. But they forgot something." He turned toward the window, toward the land that was still, his in ways no paper could touch. The storm clouds were building on the horizon, purple and black against a bleeding sunset. The air smelled like rain, like change. "This land don't scare easy," Rusty said, his voice steady now. "And neither do I." They didn't wait long to hit back. By Monday morning, the war Rusty hadn't declared came to his front porch dressed in khaki and $1,000 shoes. A sheriff's cruiser kicked up gravel on the driveway, followed by a black SUV that gleamed like a rattlesnake in sunlight. Rusty stood on the porch, coffee cooling in his hand, watching them roll up the way his daddy used to watch storms come in from the south. The deputy stepped out first, same one as before, eyes still apologizing for things his mouth couldn't say. But it wasn't the deputy Rusty was watching, it was the man who followed, Marcus Webb, city attorney, looking like sin in a suit. He climbed the steps slow, savoring the moment, carrying a stack of papers that looked heavy enough to crush a man's soul. "Morning, Mr. Thornfield," Webb said, voice slick as oil on water. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Rusty didn't answer, just looked at him. The kind of look that makes coyotes back up. Webb smiled. That smile that had probably won 100 cases and broken 1,000 promises. "Got some updates for you," he said, holding out the papers like they were a gift. "Temporary restraining order. You can't go near the construction site, can't interfere with crews, and you sure as hell can't make threats. Sheriff's office has 3 complaints on file." Rusty's jaw tightened. "That's a lie." "Maybe," Webb said, shrugging like a man discussing the weather. "But it's on paper now, and paper's what matters." Rusty didn't take the papers. Didn't want to feel that poison in his hands. But Webb wasn't done. He never was. "Oh," he said, like it just occurred to him. "You might want to check the news later. Channel 8's doing a piece on, let's see." He pulled a phone from his pocket, scrolled like a man unwrapping candy. "Ah, yes. When grief becomes greed, the rancher blocking progress." Should be a hell of a segment. Rusty didn't blink, didn't move. Just let the words hit and slide off like rain on tin. Webb hated that. Rusty could see it in the twitch of his jaw. 30 days, Webb said, stepping back. "Then we take it all. Enjoy your coffee." They left in a cloud of dust and diesel, and Rusty stood there until it settled. Then he walked inside, turned on the TV, and there it was. His name. His face. A story that wasn't his but would stick like mud for the rest of his life. They painted him as a stubborn old cowboy standing in the way of hard-working families. Showed mothers holding babies, talking about their dream homes. Teachers, nurses, people who didn't know they were pawns in a game bigger than their paychecks. And Rusty, Lord, they made him look like a monster. Grainy footage from the courthouse, a shot of him walking fence lines, hat pulled low like an outlaw. The voiceover cut deep. Some people just can't accept progress. By the time the segment ended, the phone was ringing. Rusty didn't answer. Didn't need to. He knew what they'd say. Friends asking if it was true. Neighbors offering sympathy he didn't want. Maybe even threats from people who believed the lies. He turned the phone face down and walked out, to the porch, where the air smelled like rain and rage. He sat there until the light started to die, thinking about everything he'd lost. His father. His name. And now the land. The only thing that ever made sense in a world gone sideways. For the first time, Rusty felt something close to defeat creeping up his spine like cold water. And that's when he heard it. The crunch of tires on gravel. Not the heavy growl of an SUV, not the whine of a cruiser. Something smaller, older. A pickup with a dented fender and a sound like it had lived a hard life. Rusty stood as the truck rolled up and stopped in front of the house. The door swung open, and out stepped a man in a wrinkled shirt with a tie hanging loose around his neck and a briefcase held together with duct tape. "You Rusty Thornfield?" the man asked, shutting the door with his hip. Rusty nodded slow. "Who's asking?" "Name's Jake Kowalski," the man said, walking up the steps like he belonged there. He set the briefcase on the porch rail and offered a hand. "I hear you got some trouble with folks who don't know the difference between a deed and a death warrant." Rusty stared at the hand, then took it. Firm grip, no polish, a man who'd worked for what he had. "You a lawyer?" Jake grinned. "Environmental, mostly, but I do a little property law when the mood strikes. And right now..." He popped the latches on the briefcase, pulled out a stack of papers thicker than a bull's neck. The mood striking. Rusty frowned. "I didn't call you." "Nope," Jake said, flipping pages like a man dealing cards. "But I heard what they're doing, and let's just say I don't like bullies, especially ones who tear up wetlands without the right permits." Rusty blinked. "Wetlands?" Jake turned the papers so Rusty could see. Maps, blue lines, and shaded areas he didn't recognize. "See this?" Jake tapped a finger on a section of land that looked like nothing more than a low pasture to Rusty's eye. "That's federally protected wetland. You can't build on it without EPA clearance. And guess what? Your friend Vivian didn't get clearance." Rusty felt something shift inside him, like the ground moving under his boots. Only this time, it was moving in his favor. "What's that mean?" Jake smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile a wolf gives before it takes down a deer. "It means, Mr. Thornfield, that every slab they poured, every trench they dug, every tree they bulldozed is a federal crime. And I'm about to make their life hell." Rusty didn't say a word, didn't trust himself to. He just stared at those maps, at the blue lines that had suddenly become the brightest thing he'd ever seen. For the first time in days, the weight on his chest eased a little. Not much, but enough to breathe. Jake packed up the papers and snapped, the briefcase shut. "I'll need copies of your deed," he said, "and any old surveys you got. We're going to build a case so tight they'll wish they'd never heard the word development." Rusty nodded, still feeling that strange new thing buzzing in his blood. Hope. Dangerous thing, hope. But right now, it felt like the only weapon he had. As Jake walked back to his truck, the sky split with lightning, bright enough to paint the hills white. The thunder that followed shook the porch boards under Rusty's boots. He looked out at the land, his land, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. "They started a war," he murmured, "and now they got one." Vivian didn't take the punch and fall. She came back swinging harder than Rusty could have imagined. The first blow landed before dawn on Monday. Rusty woke to the sound of diesel engines outside his window. Only it wasn't bulldozers this time. It was black SUVs with tinted glass and men in tactical gear. Security contractors, ex-military, the kind of guys who looked like they'd rather be kicking doors in Baghdad than guarding a subdivision in Texas. They set up at every entrance. To Thornfield Estates like they were defending a federal installation. Floodlights burned against the dawn, and bright yellow signs screamed, "Authorized personnel only," across what used to be open pasture. The message was clear. Rusty Thornfield was now the enemy. By mid-morning, the news vans arrived. Channel 8, Channel 5, even a crew from Dallas. They filmed families loading kids into SUVs, mothers clutching babies, men glaring at the camera while they talked about the unstable rancher who threatened their American dream. Every soundbite was poison, dripping straight from Vivian's lips. He's holding 75 families hostage, she told a reporter, her voice breaking just enough to sound real. These are teachers, nurses, first responders, hard-working, folks who just want homes for their children. But one bitter man can't let go of the past. Rusty watched it all unfold on the flickering screen in his kitchen. The anchor nodded solemnly as the headline rolled across the bottom. When grief turns to greed. He wanted to smash the television. Instead, he turned it off and stared at his reflection in the black glass. The face looking back didn't belong to the villain they were painting. It belonged to a man who'd buried his father with his own hands. A man who'd slept in a hospital chair for 42 nights straight. A man who'd spent his life fighting drought and debt and everything else the world could throw at him. But never this. When Jake showed up that afternoon, Rusty was sitting on the porch, hat low, hands clenched on his knees like he was holding himself together by sheer force. Jake climbed the steps 2 at a time, dropping his duct-taped briefcase with a thud. "They're coming hard," Jake said, pulling out papers and spreading them across the porch table. "Petitions, restraining orders, PR blitz. They even filed for an emergency hearing to have you declared mentally incompetent." Rusty looked up slow. "On what grounds?" Jake snorted. "Grief-induced psychosis. They hired some psychiatrist who's never met you to write an evaluation based on your observable behavior." Rusty let out a sound that was half laugh, half growl. "That's a new low." Jake leaned in, his eyes sharp. "This isn't about low. This is about breaking you before we can hit them back. They want you rattled. They want you desperate. Don't give them that satisfaction." Rusty stared out at the horizon, where cranes stabbed the sky and houses rose like weeds. "So what do we got?" Jake grinned, a quick, fierce flash of teeth. "More than they think." He spread out a set of documents yellowed with age, the ink faded but still proud. "Your great-granddaddy wasn't just stubborn. He was smart. He didn't sell the mineral rights when he claimed this land in 1889, which means every foundation they pour, every septic line they dig, every utility trench they carve." Jake tapped the paper hard. "Is trespassing." Rusty blinked. "Mineral rights?" The words tasted strange on his tongue, like something out of a lawyer's Bible. Jake nodded. "In Texas, mineral estate is dominant over surface. You own everything under those houses: oil, gas, limestone, even groundwater. They can't drill a hole without your permission, and if they interfere with your right to extract, you can force removal." Rusty frowned. "Removal as in bulldoze every house sitting on top of your minerals." Jake's smile turned cold. Legally, for the first time in days, Rusty felt that spark again. Hope. Dangerous hope. But hope all the same. Jake wasn't done. He reached into the briefcase and pulled out another document, newer, crisp, with numbers that made Rusty's stomach flip. "And here's the kicker," Jake said, sliding it across the table. "Ashworth Development's partnership agreement with Loner Energy, signed 8 months before Vivian ever came knocking on your daddy's door." Rusty stared at the paper. Black ink on white, cold as a headstone. $89,000 for exclusive drilling rights, contingent only on acquiring clear mineral title. "She was never building a subdivision," Rusty said, voice low, like the truth might burn if he said it too. Loud, Jake shook his head. "The houses? Just a smokescreen. She needed surface control long enough to flip the mineral rights. Once the deal closed, those homes were gone, bulldozed. Every family you see on the news, collateral damage in a land grab." Rusty sat back, hard, the porch chair creaking under his weight. He thought of those families, not the fake tears on TV, but the real ones. Kids picking bedrooms, couples signing 30-year mortgages, people who believed they were building a life while Vivian was selling them out before the paint dried. "She's playing God," Rusty whispered. "No," Jake said, eyes like gun barrels. "She's playing with dynamite, and we're about to light the fuse." Lightning forked across the horizon, white hot against a sky bruised purple with storm clouds. The wind carried the smell of rain, sharp and wild, mixing with the faint tang of diesel from the construction site. Somewhere out there, men were working under floodlights, hammering dreams into stolen dirt, dreams that would drown when the truth came roaring through. Rusty looked at Jake, and for the first time, since this started, his voice held steel. "What do we do first?" Jake smiled slow, like a wolf scenting blood. "We go federal, EPA violations, wetland destruction, mineral rights trespass, fraud. We build a case so strong it'll take more than her Escalade and a golf buddy on the council to dig her out. But first," he closed the briefcase with a snap that sounded like a gun cocking. "We let her think she's winning." Rusty stood, staring out at the land, his land, glowing under the false stars of construction lights. In the distance, thunder rolled like drums of war, and deep in his bones he felt it. The fight wasn't just for him anymore. It was for every rancher who'd ever been robbed by paper lies and city greed. For every man who still believed a handshake meant something. "They wanted a war," Rusty said, his voice low and hard as the rocks under his boots. "Now they've got one." The first sign that Vivian was running scared came on a Wednesday night, carried by the darkness like a secret with teeth. Rusty woke to silence, the kind that makes your skin prickle. No hum from the refrigerator, no buzz from the porch light. He stepped outside barefoot into air heavy with heat and something else. Wrongness. Out by the road, the power lines sagged like broken bones, clean-cut ends glinting silver in the moonlight. Someone had killed his electricity. By morning, the well pump was dead too. When Rusty pulled it apart, he found the truth gleaming in the mud, chemical residue. Industrial solvent poured straight into the system. Sabotage so clean, it smelled like money. Vivian had taken off the gloves. "You need to see this," Jake said that afternoon, slamming his laptop on the porch table. Grainy black and white footage filled the screen. Men in tactical gear moving like shadows, bolt cutters flashing in the night. Another clip, hands in latex gloves pouring liquid from an unmarked jug into the well casing. "Trail cams?" Rusty asked. Jake nodded. "I told you to trust my paranoia." Rusty stared at the footage, jaw tight enough to crack teeth. "Felonies," Jake said, his voice flat. "Utility sabotage, property destruction, attempted poisoning of livestock. I'm sending this to the DA and the feds." Rusty almost smiled, a hard, humorless twist of his mouth. "Let her dig her own grave." But Vivian wasn't digging. She was dancing on air, or that's how it looked on TV. By Thursday, the Yaiba news cycle had turned poisonous. Channel 8 ran another piece, this one with Vivian standing in front of bulldozers, hair perfect, voice trembling like a saint in a storm. "We're just trying to build homes for families," she said, eyes glossy, with fake tears. "But this man, he's dangerous. We fear for our lives." Social media exploded. Hashtags like Greedy Rancher and Let Them Live trended statewide. Bots amplified every post. Fake accounts spewed venom. Hope that old coot rots in jail. Sell the land, cowboy. Time to move on. Rusty killed the TV and turned off his phone. He didn't need their noise. Not when real thunder was rolling out of the Gulf and the air smelled like salt and judgment. Jake knew they were running out of time. "She's got money, media, and politics," he said, pacing the kitchen like a caged wolf. "We hit her hard, or we lose everything." Rusty leaned back in his chair, boots on the scarred wood floor. "So hit her." Jake grinned. "I plan to." The next 48 hours turned Rusty's old hay barn into something between a war room and a church revival. Dolores Martinez arrived first, trailing cigarette smoke and 40 years of county records. She spread maps and deeds like Holy Scripture, stabbing them with her finger as she talked. They faked surveys, forged signatures, bribed half the commission, she said, lighting another cigarette with the stub of the first. "And I got the proof to bury every last one of them." Next came Marcus Webb, not the snake from the city, but the petroleum geologist Jake called the Hammer. White. Hair, sharp eyes, and a briefcase full of mineral rights cases that had made oil companies bleed billions. He laid out cross-sections of Rusty's land like X-rays of buried treasure. Oil. Gas. "Enough to make vultures flock," Marcus said, tapping a chart with a knuckle scarred by years of field work. "Your minerals are worth 10 times the surface, and under Texas law, mineral estate is king. You can force removal of every structure interfering with extraction." Rusty stared at the charts, feeling the weight of 100 years settle on his shoulders. His great-granddaddy hadn't known about shale or royalties, but he'd known enough to hold on to what mattered. Rebecca Chen arrived last, carrying water samples and a smile that promised war. Environmental scientist, activist, and the kind of woman who'd burned more developers than the Texas sun. She dropped photographs on the table, wetlands churned to mud, creeks choked with concrete runoff, dead fish floating belly up in milky water. "This isn't just civil," she said, voice like a blade. "This is criminal. Federal violations. EPA will shut them down before you can say indictment." Rusty looked around the table at faces lit by the harsh glow of a single work lamp. Old hay smell mixed with coffee and determination so thick you could taste it. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt like the fight wasn't his alone. Jake leaned over the table, eyes hard as gunmetal. "We launch Monday. EPA complaints, injunctions, federal referrals. By Friday, they'll be drowning in subpoenas." Rusty glanced toward the barn door, where wind rattled the tin and thunder rolled closer. "Monday might be too late," he said. Jake followed his gaze to the weather radar on his laptop. The swirl of color was monstrous, a hurricane growing fat and mean over the Gulf. The name on the screen made Rusty's gut tighten. Bethany, Category 3 now. Category 4 by landfall. And every model painted the same picture. A track straight, into the hill country, straight into Thornfield Estates. "This development sits on a floodplain," Rusty said, voice low. "Always has. My granddaddy moved cattle to high ground in '52 when the river came out of its banks. Those houses?" He jerked his chin toward the glow of construction lights beyond the ridge. "They're sitting in nature's bathtub." Jake stared at the map, then at Rusty. "You think this storm?" Rusty didn't answer. Didn't have to, because some things don't need words. The barn door slammed open hard enough to shake the walls. Everyone turned. And there she was. Vivian Ashworth Sterling, framed by lightning like the devil making a house call, designer workout gear clinging to her like a second skin, hair plastered from rain, eyes wild with something Rusty had never seen before. Desperation. She strode. Inside, heels clicking on the concrete like gunfire, and dropped a metal briefcase on the table. It hit with a thud that silenced the storm for half a breath. $2 million, she said, voice sharp as broken glass. "Cash. Right now. You sign the quitclaim deed, and this all goes away." Rusty didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at her like she was something crawled out of a snake pit. "5, she snapped. $5 million. Cayman transfer, offshore, tax-free." The war room held its breath. Outside, thunder cracked so loud it rattled the windows. Rusty stood slow, every inch of him carved from stone. When he spoke, his voice was low enough to make the storm lean in to listen. "Not for $5 million, he said. "Not for 50. Not for all the damn money in Texas." Vivian's mask cracked. The perfect polish shattered, leaving something raw and ugly underneath. Her mouth twisted, her eyes flashing like a cornered predator. "You stupid hick!" she hissed. "You think this is about you? You think you matter?" Rusty stepped closer until she could smell the sweat and earth on him, the kind of scent no perfume could drown. "This ain't about me," he said. "It's about the truth. And the truth always comes home." Lightning split the sky, and for a heartbeat the barn was nothing but white fire and shadows. When the darkness fell back, Vivian was gone, storming into the rain like a queen, retreating from a battlefield she didn't own anymore. Jake watched her taillights vanish into the night and turned to Rusty with a grin that looked like war paint. "She's scared," he said. Rusty stared at the empty doorway, rain blowing, in like the breath of something ancient. "She ought to be, because the storm wasn't coming. It was already here." The rain started like a whisper, tapping on the tin roof as Rusty lay in bed staring at the dark. By midnight, it had turned to a drumbeat. By dawn, it was a war song pounding on the land. Hurricane Bethany was chewing up the Gulf and spitting, fury all over Texas. Rusty stood on the porch, watching the trees bow low, their branches clawing at the gray sky like they were praying for mercy. But the storm outside wasn't the only one closing in. At 3 a.m., Jake's phone lit up with the kind of news that makes a man taste metal in his mouth. He was already at Rusty's kitchen table, coffee cold in a mug that said, "World's Best Dad," laptop glowing like a lone star in the dark. When the alert came through, Jake cursed low and sharp, shoving the screen toward Rusty. "They did it," he said. "She actually did it." Rusty squinted at the document, the words swimming in bureaucratic poison. "Emergency evacuation order, issued by the county under public safety protocol." "She convinced the emergency coordinator you're a threat," Jake said, voice tight with fury. "Claimed you've made violent statements, said you'd sabotage the levees during the storm." Rusty's jaw locked so hard it hurt. "That's a damn lie." Jake slammed his fist on the table. "Doesn't matter. The sheriff's office is enforcing it. You've got 4 hours to leave. If you don't, they seize the property under eminent domain." Rusty felt the world tilt under his boots. 4 generations of sweat and blood, gone in the fine print of a midnight filing. He read the words again, each one a bullet. "Immediate seizure of property to ensure public safety." "They're sending bulldozers," Jake said, voice low now, like a man whispering at a graveside. "By noon, if we don't stop them, your land's gone. Permanently." Rusty stared out the window, rain streaking the glass like tears. For a second, he saw his father's face reflected there, eyes steady, jaw set, the way he looked the day he taught Rusty to ride fence in a lightning storm. "A man's land is his word, boy. You let them take that, you ain't got nothing left." The sound of tires on gravel snapped Rusty back. He pushed the curtain aside and saw headlights, cutting through the rain. 2 sheriff's cruisers, a county truck behind them, and just visible in the distance, the dark hulk of a bulldozer on a flatbed trailer, its blade gleaming like the grin of something hungry. "They're early," Jake muttered. Rusty turned, his face carved from stone. "So are we." Jake was already moving, shoving papers into his briefcase, fingers flying across his laptop keyboard. "I filed for an emergency injunction last night," he said, his voice clipped and fast. "Federal court granted it an hour ago. We've got the law on our side now. Real law, not that county good old boy crap." Rusty grabbed his hat and his father's oilskin coat from the peg by the door. "Then let's go show 'em." The drive into town was like something out of a fever dream. Rain slashed sideways, driven by winds that shoved Rusty's truck like a bully on a playground. Highway signs bent double, and live oaks groaned under the weight of a sky gone mad. Rusty gripped the wheel tight and kept his eyes on the glow of Jake's laptop as it lit the cab with a cold blue light. "They're gonna fight it," Jake said, scanning emails as fast as they hit his inbox. "Vivian's got 3 lawyers lined up and a judge she thinks is still in her pocket. But this isn't a zoning dispute anymore. This is federal." Rusty didn't answer. He was too busy watching the world he knew disappear under sheets of water. Pastures turned to lakes, creeks boiling over fences. A calf standing belly deep in floodwater where yesterday there'd been dry grass. The storm wasn't just coming. It was here. And it was hungry. By the time they reached the courthouse, the square looked like a war zone. Sandbags stacked against the doors. Deputies in ponchos waving flashlights through sheets of rain. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool and fear. Generators hummed loud enough to rattle the windows, and the emergency lights painted everything in sick yellow. The courtroom was packed. Displaced families clutching kids and evacuation bags. Reporters with cameras dripping rain onto the tile. Environmental activists live streaming from the back row. And at the center of it all, like a queen holding court in a kingdom built on lies, Vivian Ashworth Sterling. She was all polish again. Navy suit, pearls, hair perfect despite the storm howling outside. But Rusty saw the cracks, the tightness around her mouth, the twitch in her manicured hand as she shuffled papers. Judge. Hendricks sat high on the bench, her face carved from granite and twice as cold. She rapped the gavel hard enough to make the walls shudder. This emergency session will come to order. Vivian's lead attorney rose first, voice smooth as silk. Your Honor, this is about protecting lives. Mrs. Sterling's development houses 75 families in the direct path of a Category 4 hurricane. The defendant has a documented history of threats and erratic behavior. Public safety demands immediate seizure of the Thornfield property to prevent sabotage and secure the levee system. Lies. All of it. Rusty felt heat crawl up his spine, but Jake's hand on his arm was iron. Wait. When the lawyer sat, Jake stood. No tie now. Sleeves rolled. Eyes bright with the kind of fire you only see in men who fight because they have nothing left to lose. Your Honor, he said, voice cutting through the storm's distant roar, what Mrs. Sterling calls public safety, the federal government calls fraud. He dropped a stack of documents on the table, so heavy the sound cracked like a rifle shot. Wetland destruction, EPA violations, mineral rights trespass, and this. He held up the crown jewel. The original 1889 land patent, ink black as judgment. Mr. Thornfield owns this land in perpetuity, surface, subsurface, mineral estate. Every inch of dirt they've built on belongs to him. The room went still. Reporters leaned forward like hounds catching a scent. Even the judge's eyes sharpened. But Jake wasn't finished. He reached into his case and pulled out the nuclear option. Vivian's secret partnership agreement with Loniar Energy. He held it high, the rain-streaked windows casting a ghost light over the damning words. This wasn't about homes, Jake said, his voice a hammer. It was about oil. $89 million worth. Mrs. Sterling planned to bulldoze these families' houses the moment she had clear title. She sold them a dream so she could cash an energy check. Chaos erupted. Gasps, shouts, reporters, firing questions like bullets. Vivian's mask cracked wide open, her face gone the color of paper. Judge Hendricks pounded the gavel, but the storm outside was pounding harder now. Wind screaming down the streets, rain lashing the windows. Like a whip. Somewhere far off, a siren wailed. Order! The judge barked. This hearing is in recess until I review these filings. Vivian shot to her feet, pearls rattling against her collarbone. You can't do this, she hissed, but the judge didn't even look at her. Sit down, Mrs. Sterling, before the wind takes the roof off this courthouse. Lightning split the sky outside so bright it turned the room white. And for one breathless moment, everyone froze. The whole world balanced on the knife edge between law and chaos, between greed and justice, between a woman who thought she could own the earth and a storm that had other plans. Then, the lights flickered. The wind screamed louder, and Rusty Thornfield turned to the window, watching trees bend like sinners under a preacher's wrath, and thought, Mother Nature's about to pass sentence. The first window shattered like a gunshot. 1 second, the courtroom was noise and fury, reporters shouting, lawyers hissing, deputies trying to herd people like cattle. The next, The glass exploded inward in a spray of rain and razor wind that sent papers swirling like white birds in a hurricane sky. The lights died with a pop. Darkness swallowed the room, broken only by the hellish glow of lightning ripping across the horizon. Someone screamed. Someone else prayed. And then the emergency lights blinked on, sick, dim yellow that made every face look carved from wax. "Move!" a deputy barked. "Basement now!" Rusty grabbed Dolores by the arm as the crowd surged, Jake shoving the briefcase against, his chest like a life raft. They pushed through the chaos, boots sliding on rain-slick tile, while the wind outside howled like a living thing tearing at the bones of the old courthouse. They made it to the stairwell just as the sirens began to wail. That long, low moan that makes your blood run cold. The kind of sound you don't ignore. The kind that means the sky's about to fall. Down in the basement, it smelled like damp concrete and fear. Families huddled against the walls, clutching kids and Bibles. Water pooled under the emergency door, spreading slow but steady. Rusty leaned against a pillar, listening to the storm claw at the building like it wanted in. Jake was on his phone, voice tight. "Cell towers are down," he muttered. "No signal. We're flying blind." Rusty looked at him. "Then we wait." But waiting felt like drowning. Every second stretched thin as barbed wire, every gust of wind a reminder that the world above was tearing itself apart. And then came the sound. A deep, distant roar that didn't belong to wind or thunder. Rusty felt it in his bones before he understood. Water. Moving fast. "Moving hard! Levee's gone," he said, his voice flat. "I told them those levees wouldn't hold." The deputy near the door swore under his breath. "River's 2 miles east." "Not anymore," Rusty said. The basement door slammed, open, and Vivian blew in like the storm itself, hair wild, mascara running, heels clattering on the wet floor. But her eyes still burned with that same fire, that same refusal to bow even when the world was breaking around her. "This is your fault," she screamed, jabbing a finger at Rusty. "You did this! You sabotaged!" Lightning flashed so bright it turned the room white. The thunder that followed shook the floor like God himself had slammed a fist on the table. Rusty didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at her with the kind of calm that comes when a man has nothing left to lose. "I warned you," he said, his voice low but carrying over the roar above. "Told you this land don't scare easy." Vivian's mouth opened, some sharp, retort ready to slice. But the wind took it, literally tore the sound from her lips as the stairwell door blew off its hinges and slammed against the wall like a cannon shot. Rain knifed through the gap, cold and hard as nails. "Upstairs!" a deputy yelled. "Roof's going!" The next 10 minutes blurred into madness. Rusty hauling kids onto his shoulders, shoving old men toward the hall. Jake dragging boxes of evidence like they were gold. Vivian clinging to her briefcase like a drowning woman clutching a Bible. And all the while, the storm screamed louder, tearing pieces off the courthouse, hurling them into the black. They made it to the main floor. Just as the front doors gave way, a wall of water exploding through like a freight train made of mud and fury. Rusty grabbed the nearest pillar and held on, the current ripping at his legs like it wanted to drag him into hell. People screamed, furniture crashed, glass shattered under the weight of a world gone wild, and then silence. Not real silence, but that strange hollow quiet that comes when the worst has passed. Rusty opened his eyes to a world he barely knew. The courthouse was half gone. One whole wall ripped away, opening on a landscape drowned in black water and silver lightning. Where the square had been was now a river, boiling with debris, cars, fence posts, someone's porch swing spinning like a toy. Rusty staggered outside, boots sinking in mud that hadn't been there an hour ago. The rain had eased to a hard mist, the wind down to a ragged breath. But the sky still churned, bruised and boiling, like it wasn't done yet. He turned toward Thornfield Estates, or what was left of it. The lights were gone. The streets were rivers, and the houses. Lord, the houses were bones, frames ripped apart, walls sheared clean, roofs floating like broken promises. He saw one of those shiny HOA signs spinning in the current, the words mocking in the lightning's flash, "Welcome to Thornfield Estates, where dreams live." Dreams were drowning. Tonight. Rusty waded out onto what had been the highway, the water cold as a grave. He could hear crying, shouting, the distant whine of a siren that would never get through. Deputies were pulling people into John boats, hauling kids in life jackets that glowed like neon hope in the dark. And then he saw her, Vivian Ashworth Sterling, Queen of Lies, standing waist-deep in black water, her pearls gleaming like tiny moons against the ruin of her suit. She still had the briefcase, still clutching it like it could save her. But her eyes were wild now, not with power, not with pride, with fear. "Help me!" she screamed, voice breaking like glass. Rusty didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with rain running down his face, watching the water take back everything she'd stolen. A John boat slid past, 2 deputies reaching for her. She grabbed their hands, clawing like a drowning cat, and they hauled her in. The briefcase slipped from her grip, vanishing into the black without a sound. Rusty turned away. Not because he hated her, because he didn't. Not anymore. Hate was too small for what this night had become. He climbed the ridge above the highway and looked out over the valley. His valley, now a lake shimmering under a broken sky. And for the first time since this war began, he felt something like peace. The land had passed judgment, and judgment had been absolute. Behind him, Jake, slogged up the hill, soaked and grinning like a man who'd stared into the storm and lived to tell it. "You okay?" he asked, breathless. Rusty watched a section of rooftop spin away into the dark. "Ask me when the sun comes up." Lightning flared one last time, etching the drowned world in bone-white fire. And in that flash, Rusty saw the truth his father had always known. You don't own the land, you borrow it, and when it's done with you, it takes itself back. Morning came like an apology, soft and slow over a world that didn't look the same. Rusty stood on the porch of what was left of his house, roof torn, windows gone, mud streaked up the walls like war paint. The wind had died, but the silence it left behind was worse than the screaming storm. It wasn't real silence. It was broken fences, drowned cattle, the hiss of water still creeping through the low ground like something alive. The sky was a bruised canvas of gray and gold, clouds peeling back to let the sun bleed through. Its light hit the valley below and turned the flood into a sheet of fire, beautiful and cruel all at once. Where Thornfield Estates had stood was now an inland sea. The cul-de-sacs, the manicured lots, the clubhouse with its ridiculous stone arches, all gone. Just rooftops bobbing like tombstones in a black lake, the words, "Future Homes," starting at $4.99K floating on a piece of splintered sign. Rusty's boots were caked with mud up to his knees, his hands were raw from hauling strangers out of water that wanted them dead. He'd spent the night in hell, ferrying kids in John boats, pulling old folks onto rooftops, tying makeshift anchors when the current tried to rip everything loose. Vivian had screamed until her voice broke, clutching at deputies like they were life preservers. And then she'd gone quiet, staring out at the ruin of her kingdom with eyes like shattered glass. Now the storm was gone, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. Jake found him on the porch, soaked to the bone, his hair plastered flat, his tie hanging like a noose around his neck. He dropped the duct-taped briefcase on the rail with a thud. "Federal marshals are on their way," he said. "EPAs, already issuing stop work orders. State AG wants her in Austin by Friday. Rusty didn't look at him, just kept his eyes on the water. Charges? Jake's grin was sharp as barbed wire. Fraud, racketeering, environmental destruction, and about 6 dozen counts of felony negligence. She's done. Rusty nodded once. Slow. Like a man hearing the weather report on a day when the sky's already clear. They'll indict half the county commission, too, Jake added. Bribes, forged permits, campaign kickbacks. Dolores had receipts for everything. Rusty almost smiled. Almost. She always did. Jake leaned on the rail, staring out at the drowned dream below. Funny thing, he said. All that money, all those lawyers, all those speeches about progress, and in the end, he shook his head, rain dripping from his hair. One storm did what we couldn't. Rusty finally turned to look at him, and there was no triumph in his eyes, no gloating, just the weight of a truth too big for victory. Storm didn't do it, he said. Greed did. They stood in silence a while, watching the rescue choppers skim the valley, their rotors chopping, the wet air to ribbons. Down below, deputies were stringing yellow tape where streets had been. Reporters waded through mud in designer boots, chasing shots of shattered lives they'd forget by next week. And in the middle of it all, Vivian Ashworth Sterling sat on. The tailgate of a Humvee, hair plastered, pearls gone, a gray blanket draped around shoulders that used to carry empires. She didn't look like a queen anymore. She looked like a ghost. Think she'll do time? Rusty asked. Jake shrugged. If there's any justice left in Texas. Rusty didn't answer, just stared at her, at the ruin she'd built on the bones of other people's dreams. And for the first time since this started, he felt something that surprised him. Pity. The sun climbed higher, burning the mist off the hills, painting the floodwater in gold. Somewhere, a meadowlark started to sing like it didn't know the world had ended. Rusty closed his eyes for a moment and let the sound cut through the noise in his head. When he opened them, the light was brighter, the sky wider, and the valley still his. Not the way it used to be, not the way he wanted, but his. By sunset, the choppers were gone, the roads washed out, and the land lay quiet under a sky scraped clean by wind. Rusty walked the ridge above the creek, or what used to be a creek, and now ran wide and wild like a river reclaiming old paths. The mud sucked at his boots, heavy as sin, but he didn't mind. He'd walked this ground when it was dust. He'd walk it now when it was drowning. Because that's what you do when something's in your blood. He stopped by the old windmill, the one his daddy fixed 100 times with nothing but baling wire and spit, and leaned against its rusted leg. The horizon was a fire line of red and gold. And for the first time in what felt like years, Rusty let himself breathe. They'd rebuild. Not the houses, not the lies, the truth. Fences, pasture, maybe cattle again when the grass came back. He didn't know how long it would take. Didn't care. Because time was something the land gave you if you respected it. And Lord knew he'd earned that respect now. Jake came up behind him, hands in his pockets, the duct-taped briefcase still hanging like an old wound. Court'll restore title next week, he said. Mineral rights, everything. It's yours, Rusty. All of it. Rusty didn't look at him, just kept his eyes on the horizon where the last light bled out of the day. It was never mine, he said softly. Jake frowned. What do you mean? Rusty turned then, his face carved by sun and storm and something older than both. You don't own the land, he said. You borrow it, from the ones who came before, from the ones who'll come after, and when you forget that. He nodded toward the valley, where the black water still gleamed like an unblinking eye. It reminds you. The wind shifted then, carrying the smell of wet earth and cedar, sharp and clean like a promise. Rusty closed his eyes and breathed it deep, letting it settle in his bones like scripture. When he opened them again, the storm was gone, the stars were coming out, and the land, his land, was waiting. and for the first time since the fight began, Rusty Thornfield smiled. Not because he'd won, because he'd endured. And sometimes, that's enough.